keynote speaker, Mrs. Lola Adekoye, the country director for Center for International Private Enterprises. Sorry. Mrs. Adekoye is the deputy regional director for Africa and the country director for Nigeria at the Center for International Private Enterprises, which we know as SIPE. She oversees a diverse portfolio of programs and manages the accountability, governance, and integrity portfolio across sub-Saharan Africa and serves on various SIPE committees, including compliance and standard setting. Mrs. Adekoye advises global teams on innovations in accountability and integrity and governance, and leads SIPE's flagship initiative, Ethics First, designed to promote low-risk investment in Africa and create an accountable business ecosystem. Beyond SIPE, however, Mrs. Adekoye serves on high-profile boards and committees like the Bretton Woods Committee, which we'll be talking about here, shaping global policy and standard. She's a licensed attorney in New York and Nigeria, holding 2 Masters of Law degrees from Georgetown University and the University of Warwick, as well as a postgraduate certificate from the Cambridge University's George Business School. Mrs. Adekoye is skilled in institutional reform, multi-stakeholder cooperation, and public policy aimed at transparency and accountability investment. She has advised stakeholders in over 10 countries on topics such as international financial regulations, illicit financial flows, and business integrity. Her passion for innovative solutions and leveraging technology to enhance accountability in emerging markets drives her work and support for grassroots foundations and charities in her spare time. This is why she's considered the appropriate person to give us a keynote presentation on the topic, promoting multilateral cooperation, benchmarking governance practices for national development. Before I invite her, a few quick notes. I intend to respect the 30 minutes for us here, which will be divided into 3 minutes opening statements after the presentation. I will make 2 questions of each of our distinguished experts here, and I would hopefully encourage a more important conversation. My approach will be that when I have to respond to her, I will give an opening statement. The rest will be about this hall. This particular topic, and I would like for us to pay attention. This particular topic is so critical because it defines the whole game and the whole world. And so on that note, permit me to invite Mrs. Lola Adekoye. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I must first of all say, I just asked our moderator how much time I have. He said, take your time, and I'm a lawyer. Okay, I have a presentation. Good morning, everyone. Hello to, I see Ayatollah on the call, online, so I see that you're here, great. Thank you so much for that very eloquent introduction and, the good lay of the land. I have just 10 minutes. If the presentation can show online, that would be great, but if it doesn't, Mr. Femi already did a nice expo on the presentation, which you can find. You can just Google him and the topic, and you might find it and you can follow. I think it's really helpful to be able to show the excellent. Thank you. So without further ado, I think when I saw this topic, I was very excited. I sent Mr. Neris a message and I said, this is such an important topic to be talking about in a place like this. There's one more civil society colleague on the panel here, but most of us are business people. But you do business across many countries. And, for a minute, you would think that what's the connection of the discussion about multilateralism and, in international relations to businesses. And I hope that I can make that case really clear to you. I think when Angela was talking about UBA in 20 countries, it started to dawn on me that, we didn't even think about how important this conversation is or the depth of importance until IODCCG put it on the agenda, which is big credit to the team that put together this conference for, coming up with very, very important topics. So very quickly, I think we already introduced SIPE a little bit, so I'm just going to skip the first slide, go straight to unpacking this topic. And to unpack it, I'll start by talking about, it says multilateral cooperation. Essentially, it's talking about multilateralism in how governments, and especially governments, countries, sovereigns, nations, think about foreign policy and their own development. In this room, you can already think about a lot of multilateral agreements or institutions that Nigeria is a part of. And why countries go into multilateral arrangements, cooperations, sometimes they're just forums that we're a part of, is usually for the reasons that you see up there. You know, promoting peace or preventing conflict. As we've become more of a global economy, you know, things have become more globalized. COVID showed us that something that happened all the way in Asia could affect us here. As cross-border interactions increases, it turns out that it's true that no country is an island. And so the idea of multilateralism is the understanding that, okay, no country can progress alone or can do it alone. There's also another school of thought around competition. You know, and this is why benchmarking is important. You know, in this room, we already compared ourselves to India just a minute ago, right? And to China. And some others would want to compare us to the other BRICS, you know, because that's sort of our competition. Those are our peers. In terms of, you know, when you talk about emerging or developing economies, we're saying, well, we are in the group of companies that have majority of small, mid-sized entities. We have a lot of companies that are in the informal sector. In terms of how effective our regulatory policies are, in terms of our capacity to implement them, we are in the group of companies that have limited funding capacity to implement our policies to achieve the sort of GDP growth that we want to achieve. And so because of those similarities, we often want to, when we go into multilateral agreements, you want to set goals and targets that are reasonable for us. We want to benchmark with countries that have similar challenges like us. Benchmarking with the US, that's great, but we are talking of an economy that is what? 50 times one state in the US is about 10 times the economic size of the entire country, right? So you want to benchmark with countries that have similar challenges. What's the advantage of doing that? You can learn from each other. You can pull resources from each other. So actually, if you go to the next slide, I've started talking about some of the things on the next slide. You have similar issues to deal with, and you also have similar aspirations. So let me talk about three in the international relations space. There are three features of a multilateral arrangement that you want to look out for to say, oh, this is a fair multilateral arrangement. And that's because a lot of times when we go into multilateral agreements, it's not only with countries that are at our level in terms of growth and development, but a lot of times the countries are, you know, on a spectrum in terms of growth and development. So some of the major multilateral arrangements we have, a lot of the ones under the United Nations framework, has Nigeria, but it also has larger economies like Germany, and then you'll have other smaller economies like, you know, Chad or Niger. And so when you have that kind of range, what it also means is some of them have a stronger bargaining power when they're negotiating the terms, and others don't. Some of them have more resources to implement and meet the benchmarking standards set, but others don't. How do you make sure that there's a fair level playing field? Nigeria gets the same benefits as Germany, you know. And so these are three features that, if we have time, we'll break down a bit more. The first one is an indivisibility of interests among participants, or, you know, members. A great example of this would be, I think, Article 4 or 5 that we might have heard about with regards to the NATO. We all know the NATO agreement, right? It's a security agreement for countries in the Balkans, former Soviet Union countries. Actually, coming home, we all know the AES, the new security arrangement set up by 3 countries that pulled out of ECOWAS. It's similar to that. And it's the kind of idea, it's the idea that, you know, if one country is attacked, all countries are attacked and everybody steps in to protect that country, regardless of, whether you are the richest, or you are the nicest, or you are the country that hosted the last meeting of the multilateral partners. So that's an important feature. Our interests are connected, and we will all equally support all of our interests. The other interesting one is the commitment to diffuse reciprocity. Let me skip and just go to, if you skip and go to slide 6, you'll see, what that means essentially. Now, this second commitment is an interesting principle that talks about, the best example is the ECOMOG, Nigeria's involvement in a security arrangement in the old days when we had lots of wars. And the idea being, if a country needs support, peacekeeping forces, who spends their resources to provide that? So coming to the private sector and the economy discussions, if we have a multilateral agreement to drive and promote financial inclusion, and we have this third principle or this second principle in that agreement, which really should be a part of the ECOWAS agreement, some of our recs. Not every country will be able to afford to invest in that goal. And so what is the role of a Nigeria in helping Benin Republic invest in that goal, right? And that's what this says, basically. If a country can support, can fund, it's similar to what we do when we go to COP. COP is the climate meetings that we have under the United Nations framework. And we say, look, we all have a goal, but African countries may not be able to fund some of those, transition to gas or transition to renewable energy goals that you want us to meet. And so what's the role of partners to make that happen? I'll come to why this is important. The final, the third feature, and that would be on slide 7, is pretty much straightforward. It's a sort of arbitration. It's a dispute settlement feature. I'll just mention that aside from multilateralism, there are other isms. But, we know about unilateralism. Many countries, of course, act alone. I want to note that multilateralism is not the only way to go. It's important, it's useful, and many multilateral instruments, either institutions or just the agreements like the AFTA, CFTA, they are complicated. They're really complicated. But for countries that are in the phase that we are in terms of our developmental goals, which means what we want to achieve is a whole lot, but the resources and the capabilities to achieve those goals don't match up with where we want to go. And you might be wondering, is that not the case for every country? Actually, no. For countries that have met a lot of the United Nations developmental indicators, there are lots of them. There's the Human Development Index, many of them in terms of social, economic, and to some extent political indicators. They are now starting to set the pace for the future. They're now starting to say, what should the future of work look like? Should the future of environmental and climate change management look like? So we haven't even attained some of those goals. Our HDI indicators demonstrate very poor performance and other indicators as well. So in terms of where we are, there are a few poorer countries, to be honest, are in the same bracket as us. And I'm coming to that because this topic about multilateralism now brings me to benchmarking. So we have or are in multilateral arrangements, a lot of them. The OSGF, the Office of the Secretary of the Government of the Federation, notes that we are in about 235 multilateral agreements in Nigeria at the moment. Some of them are hollow, meaning they don't have the force of monitoring. Some of them are merely forums, but a lot of them Nigeria is truly committed to, like the AFCFTA on trade. There are some on toxic waste, managing toxic waste, which was a major problem when dumping of batteries and non-biodegradable items was happening in our country. So there are a lot of them. But the question is, how effective are we with implementing them? and what are the gaps that we have. And when you come to the economy, that's where it starts to touch on the private sector and touch on business and the ability for businesses to grow within Nigeria, but also grow outside of Nigeria. So let's talk about how rigid or complex setting up multilateral agreements can be, very briefly. And this is to draw your attention to the fact that, as my dear fellow panelist mentioned, he's from a civil society organization. Civil society organizations are somehow in and around the corridors of where multilateral agreements are negotiated. They are usually not in the room when the negotiations happen. And what that means is the negotiations are government to government only. A lot of times consultations do not happen with the private sector about the terms of the multilateral agreements that we enter into. You remember the AFCFTA was case in point. The president was on his way to sign the AFCFTA, then he came back, and then they said, oh, we need to have more consultation, right? And that's where the rubber meets the road for the private sector. If we are no longer at a point where businesses cannot and will not transact across borders. So if UBA is in 20 countries, it means that the regulations that affect UBA in Nigeria would also affect, UBA would have to comply with those. But UBA in Ethiopia would also have regulations. UBA everywhere else would have regulations that apply to them. If those regulations are not harmonized, it creates a challenge for UBA. And they can be harmonized when it comes to the economy. So it's time up. But I had a few more things on the slide. I'll just end with slide 11 and 12 very quickly. And if you're already thinking, what is an example of multilateral benchmarking? Remember the SDGs? They are a very good example. So let me show you this slide very quickly. Success factors. And when I'm talking about success factors, I'm not talking about it from the perspective of the international organizations, but I'm talking about it from the perspective of the countries that have signed those multilateral agreements, because the benefit accrues to the countries first, then builds up to the international scene. And so there are multilateral agreements that have been successful. One example is the Paris Accord. It's particularly successful because of number three, transparency, accessibility to the step-by-step goals that have been set for countries, but it's also progressive. So a country can start at no climate policy at all and grow. And guess what? It always increases the GDP or increases value, employment for those countries. So there's benefit to the private sector to pay attention to the multilateral agreements we get into and whether they are good or they are a waste of time or waste of resources. Another good one is the FATF, the Financial Actions Task Force. Dr. O, your FRCN, I'm sure, uses the resources every time, and all of the financial institutions here as well. Nigeria has been grey listed, but with the private sector collaborating, this summit is about private-public collaboration with financial regulators. I'm sure our financial regulation regime or regulatory regime can benefit from that kind of collaboration and make sure we don't see ourselves in the grey list again because of the impact on our economies. So I'll just end. Definitely take a look at the presentation. I'll end on the National Development Plan for Nigeria from 2021 to 2025. It expires next year. I believe the Ministry of Finance and Budget and Planning, probably two separate entities now, one of them or both of them will be working on the next one for next year. And a lot of times the NDP points to the benchmarks that Nigeria wants to track according to the multilateral agreements that we've signed on. I would say if you just put that slide on, we can continue the conversation from there, just so that you can see the objectives of the last NDP at a high level, and you can see how those have an impact on the poverty levels, on the growth and economic growth levels, social developmental growth that our country can have. Excellent. And you can also think about what multilateral agreements will support this. The benefit of that is where we lack resources, our MDA arrangements can support us there. Where we lack ideas, where we need professional collaborations from other countries, our commitment on multilateral agreements can support Nigeria with things like that. So thank you. I had to rush this, but I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
So here's what will happen. The organizers have asked that I provide a response to Lola's statement, and thereafter go to the panelists for their opening remarks. So my response will be as follows. Leave the English. At the end of the day, it is about trade and business. Unilateralism, bilateralism, or multilateralism, at the end of the day, pay attention. It is about trade and business. And there are three levels to this thing. So you have on the state side, where you have on the professional side, then you have at the industry levels. It is important that we appreciate the fact that the challenge up to date, especially I want to speak to Nigeria and how it relates to corporate governance, is that underpinning all those three levels is where corporate governance actually plays a role. And the issue of benchmark becomes much more important because of the challenges which multilateralism is actually facing today. The first major challenge of it is that it is not only a complex, time-consuming, and very difficult process that takes so long a time to agree. By the time the agreement is taking place, the reason why you went into the agreement no longer holds valid. That's one. Two, because of the funding structure within those multilateral agencies, you find out that the person who has the most money dictates the tune, which also means, number three, they have a very inefficient decision-making process. You do not have a very good society when you have somebody having veto. It already tells you that you are not on equal playing field. Again, don't forget what I said. It's around the trade and business. The other thing is that there's what I call the endemic structural impairments. You see, at the end of the day, whoever dictates the standards, whoever dictates the testing certification, calls the shot. That is why at any point in time, if you take an entity like the WTO, for example, organizations would have, countries would have to look at, an organization will have to look at and consider whether it's in their best interest on any policy whatsoever. So here is what it comes down to. The link between companies and countries are getting very, very blurred right now. And the best country for you to look at to understand this is France. France operates a revolving door between its public and private sector. And as such, all those things Financial Reporting Council is talking about may no longer be fit for purpose in the modern world, I can assure you. Because the way regulation looks at corporate governance, therefore, means that it is about what? A sovereign interest. In a country where you cannot define your national interest clearly, to understand that your private sector is a critical component of your foreign policy, of your economic growth, you then have a challenge with multilateralism. And as such, when we then get to the benchmarks which we need, benchmarks like compliance with Basel, as people setting us compliance in terms of FATF, or in fact, even our financial reporting standards, in terms of what's being most spoke about in terms of sanctions, instead of deterrence, because it's prevalent in your environment, it becomes a critical issue. So my remark is one, we have moved away even from multilateralism right now. Most countries are adopting what you call a collaborative mindset. That means you find where your interest lies. And like Lola spoke to us about what happened with the 3 countries that moved from the G5 Sahel group. Companies are going to mix. There is a whole lot of concentric circles being formed right now. Alliances are moving in and out and what. But it is important that for us in this room, I'll be looking forward to asking questions to help us understand what is our own interest and how can we achieve our own interest within Nigeria. It is high time we begin to understand that we are also able to set standards. Lastly, you may have heard about this digital literacy certification that is currently on right now. It will interest you also to know that Nigeria has a member on the board. But did you know that when they put those certifications together, there was no certification for USSD, which our financial system uses? Now, some individual who happens to be patriotic What I mean by that is that it wasn't by design, it's just by default. He raised it and we went back to change it. So when they are sitting down putting those standards in place, who is speaking for us in the room? On that note, I'm going to pass the mic and start. Sorry, I told I was starting with Prof, but let me default because Madam Benedict is there. I will default to the lady. Please, can you start with you? Can you help me pass the mic? Just opening remarks, 3 minutes, and then I'll move back to Prof, and then we start again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Ms. Lola, for a wonderful presentation. My name is Somachi Chris-Asoloka. I'm the CEO of the Tony Elumelu Foundation, and our focus is around empowering young African entrepreneurs from all 54 African countries. And we do this for 3 main reasons. One, to drive job creation. We know that the governments and big companies alone will not be able to create the millions of jobs that our continent needs to transform in the 21st century. We know that SMEs and MSMEs create the maximum number of jobs in any economy, and we want to support these SMEs to grow and scale and create jobs in the millions to power our continent to prosperity. The second reason why we empower young African entrepreneurs is because we also want to ensure that we eradicate poverty in our lifetime. For too long, Africa has been synonymous with the basket case, the capital of poverty in the world, and we want that to change at the Tony Elumelu Foundation. And that's why we have disbursed over $100 million to 20,000 entrepreneurs across all 54 African countries, because we know that these entrepreneurs can create prosperity and revenue to drive Africa to a new wealth creation base and eradicate poverty. And the third reason and final reason why we do what we do is because we want to ensure inclusive economic empowerment. For too many economies on the continent, women are left out of the labor force. We cannot win as a continent if half of our team is sitting on the bench. So we're ensuring that we're giving women the tools, the resources, the financing, the training, the access to start small businesses, scale these small businesses, and participate actively in economic creation in their countries. So this is why we do what we do, and in the context of this discussion, we will not be able to achieve the impact that we've created, given that our 20,000 entrepreneurs have created over 400,000 jobs in only a few years and generated over $2.5 billion in revenue. This has happened in just a few years. And the reason this has happened is definitely through our work, but also our partnerships with multilaterals around the world. We're in active partnerships with the European Union, with the United Nations Development Program, with the German Development Agency, with the United States American African Foundation, and several multilaterals across Africa and across the world. And so we're a part of all these active discussions around how to channel development aid on the continent more effectively, so that it's not just used in the same way it's been used in the past, that has resulted to little to no value, but we're helping them rethink and reimagine how to engage with the African continent in a way that prioritizes young people, in a way that prioritizes entrepreneurship, and in a way that prioritizes sustainable long-term development, so that Africa can develop with dignity and by empowering our young people. So I think I was giving 2 minutes, so I'll wrap up here, but we're delighted to be here. We're delighted to participate, to network, and to learn around what other actors in this space are up to.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to make my opening statement around 4 key areas. First is the tri-sector approach. Globally, it has been recognized that the development of every country requires active participation, partnership, and collaboration between public sector, private sector, and civil society. So I think that the theme should have actually been public, private, civil society collaboration. Second issue is that governance in these 3 sectors affect development. And the role of government is to create the enabling environment. And that enabling environment is deep and widespread, including how to bring about security, how to extract revenue, the policies, compliance, and judiciary to even adjudicate on business cases and so on. I think the challenge we have is that governance is not being able to create that enabling environment for business to thrive. Let me just give one example. We are over 200 million people. The budget of Nigeria for 2019 was $29 billion. The budget of South Africa, which is about 25% of the population of Nigeria, was $130 billion. So we have a revenue problem. The budget of Nigeria is smaller than the budget of Angola, of South Africa, of Egypt. So there is a lot of things that needs to be done in terms of governance, improving development. The third issue is what the moderator said about multilateralism dictating the standards. There has been effort in the past to ensure that aid effectiveness is globally done in terms of the Paris Declaration, the Accra Declaration, and the Busan Declaration. But I think the challenge for us as Africans is to turn from receivers of rule to makers of rule. And the way you can do that is to improve your domestic capacity, because domestic policy influences foreign policy. The final point is the issue of benchmarking. And there are various global benchmarks, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Open Government Partnership, and the African Peer Review Mechanism. And even there are also global governance indices, including the Mo Ibrahim Governance Index. The challenge we have in Nigeria is that most of those indices, Nigeria fares very poorly. And what needs to be done to improve all of these issues is known. The challenge for us is the leadership, strategy, and commitment to make the changes that are required.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I think there's something about truth. It neither invites you or pleads with you to believe in it. It just has consequences. So my take on the essence would be, why do we benchmark? What happens if I don't benchmark? So it was Arthur Levitt, he used to be the chairman of U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, that said, if a country has a reputation for poor corporate governance practices, capital will go elsewhere. Nobody's begging you. They just move elsewhere. If a country adopts lax accounting, reporting policies, and that's why I was very happy to hear FRCN speak this morning on stepping up the game, capital will go elsewhere. Now, the tragedy in it is that Levitt says that it doesn't matter whether a particular company is doing so well. Collectively, that country then has a tag as where capital shouldn't go. Capital will still go elsewhere. And if it manages to attract capital still, it will be at a very high cost of expectations of returns. So that is the reason why no one is pleading with us to benchmark. President de la Madrid used to be of Mexico, and he said, capital has no heart. It has no soul, it has no emotions. The only thing it sees is minimum economic environment for its returns. A sound legal system where it can get reparations. So what we're talking about this morning is a long-term thing, right? We cannot solve anything on the immediate. It refreshes my mind the conversations I was having with Dr. Takang on dealing with Nigeria's problems would be things that we should look at long to mid-term. Even when you go and see a doctor, the first thing he inflicts on you is pain. It's called an injection. But that injection, you feel the pain, but there's supposed to be relief coming afterwards. So that's the first thing I just want to talk about. The importance of benchmarking is not a plea, it's a necessity. The second thing, to not repeat what my colleagues have talked about, is dealing with corruption. Now, you may preach anti-corruption messages, you may lock up some when you get them, but that is not the root of dealing with corruption. There's an academic, Robert Kliggard, that gave a formula, and you can scribble it. C equals M plus D minus T. So C is corruption. It says whenever you have monopoly plus discretion in the officials, how they arrive at it without oversight, and there's an absence of transparency, corruption will thrive. It doesn't matter whether you lock up some, preach it overnight, corruption will thrive. And to break corruption institutionally, and that's the message we should take out of the governance of it in these discussions, is you have to break the monopoly. Illustration of that principle, NCC, Telcom, GSM bidding. No one anymore begs you to pay them to remove your phone on toss. Does anybody remember your line is on toss? Only Gen Zs won't remember. Now, because there's so many providers and you get your phone line for nothing. The bidding itself was done on live TV. So you have to be a demon to be corrupt on live TV whilst the bidding was being televised. And Lagos State, as an illustrative example, dealt a bit with corruption in land valuation at a governance level. It used to be the case that if you paid a land officer something at the back, he could say your building was worth 10 million when it's actually worth 100. What did Lagos State do? Put transparency. There's now per square meter cost. If it's in Ikoyi, it's 10,000 per square meter. If it is in Apapa. So that way, the discretion was removed. What I speak about are things that you can implement in your own institutions. If you concentrate powers, there'll be corruption. If you don't deal with transparency and discretion issues, there'll be corruption. Now, when we deal with benchmarking with certain institutions, we learn. And the speaker talked about when you deal with an IFC, they will tell you standards of investment, which if you don't meet, they won't invest. And if the fact that they even invest in your entity invites other people to invest at affordable costs to you. So my touch or addition to the conversation will be deal with the right, and when you're going to benchmark, please find who your mate is. Huh? Yeah, don't go benchmarking. I often say when we say developing economy, it's so generic. Dubai, developing economy, Brazil, and so many others. So find the right metrics for who you would like to benchmark with, and that creates the basis for effective benchmarking that you will gain from. I'll pause here.
Thank you, Prof. To manage time, I'm just going to condense most of the questions into actionable points. I'll go to Lolada. One of the few tricks I've learned in Nigeria's analyst field is the issue of relative and absolute. And we use it often whenever we talk about benchmarks. So, Ayotola. Oh, Ayotola. Hi, Ayo. Ayo, please go ahead and give your opening remarks. Can you kindly unmute her?
So much, and my apologies for not being there in person. I had all good intentions to be there, but work calls and work duties meant that I was out of the country for longer than I had expected. I want to just thank the organizers and for inviting me to participate in this panel, and also to thank Lola for her presentation. I think my opening comments are threefold, and you know, Femi, you've spoken to quite a lot of the issues with multilateralism. including the power imbalance. And that in itself, the very fact that there's a power imbalance means that we're coming into the game much later in the day. Look at something like climate change. We still don't have our own market, and we're having to participate on the voluntary market and at a disadvantage. We're still playing catch up. The other thing I want to speak about when it comes to multilateralism is the fact that there has been a breakdown of trust when it comes to the citizens and citizen governance and their ability to really trust government, again, because of the issue of corruption, as mentioned by Professor Ajogun. And so increasingly, and this is also a generational issue, you have the citizens turning to private sector to bring about change that they actually want to see in the country, because they can't wait another 4 or 5 years for regime change to happen. And so the rise in activism, whether it's environmental activism or social activism, is something that we see and compels us as the private sector to actually get involved in governance in a practical, tangible way, to raise standards and to bring about that national development that we want to see. Think back to COVID and the role that the private sector played in helping government to be able to deliver what the people needed and really get us out of what was an unexpected risk that hit the whole world. So there's no doubt that multilateralism is key. However, I think the private sector, like you rightly said, Femi, it's being brought in very late in the day into the negotiation. So basically, the die has been cast, everything is set, and then we have to relate it. What does it mean for the private sector? How do we interpret all these treaties, whether it's UNCAC or FATF or the Kyoto Agreement? How do we then translate it in a way that works for us? Again, looking at our national context and looking at where we are and the resources that are available to us. So you say, okay, we have so much money available in terms of climate funding or green funding. How much of it is getting to us as a country, and what are the hurdles we have to cross and scale to be able to access that funding? But being positive, I'd like us to kind of like narrow it down to public, private, not-for-profit sector, and the fact that this is also a multilateral collaboration. And whether it's on an international or on a local basis, we have the ability to ourselves look at what other countries are doing and what they have done, look at our own local context and what works for us, and see how we can collaborate in terms of collective action now to drive the change that we want to see within our own country. The ability to join international organizations like the Global Compact, like the World Economic Forum, and tap into some of the things that they've done around transformational governance, around, there's a new initiative that I'm working on with the World Economic Forum's Partnering Against Corruption initiative, which is on climate change governance and looking at the whole issue of licensing and permitting across board, and being able to draw in colleagues from other jurisdictions, from the public sector, the private sector, and the not-for-profit sector, to sit down and begin to look at how we can drive this, how we can be at the fore of shaping policy and be at the fore of interpreting agreements that are already in place, I think is really, really important. And so I guess my call, being a member of the private sector, is to again call on other private sector players to get involved. Again, I want to thank the FRC for the great work they're doing on the code of governance for the public sector and for the not-for-profit sector, because there's no point in having a governance code for the private sector and there isn't one in all the other sectors that we're talking about when it comes to their role in collaboration, their role in multilateralism. And I'm just going to end there. That's really my opening statement. Only to say I am 100% in support of your comments regarding the endemic structural challenges that we face, the funding deficit, and also the power play that needs to be somehow bridged. Cannot be taken away altogether, but somehow kind of de-risked in how we move forward with our own corporate governance frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayo. I would likely come back to you to talk to us about the ESG Governance Compact, but this time you would not put on your lawyer hat. You will keep it straightforward. Straightforward, Lola. What is Nigeria benchmarking with? Let me repeat that question. Who is Nigeria benchmarking with? As it relates to multilateralism and then especially on corporate governance. Explain that for me, really. When you talk about benchmark and their development plan, please help us.
Great, okay. So that's a very easy question, so I'll extend it a little bit more. Nigeria is actually benchmarking with the world. I think most countries in the world are benchmarking with the world. There are some countries that have a foreign policy of unilateralism, but they still try to hold themselves accountable to the SDGs. And the SDGs, more than almost every country in the world except perhaps 3 or 4, don't benchmark with the SDGs, and there are others. Some of them we've already talked about on this panel. I think what is interesting to note when it comes to multilateralism and its complexity and rigidity and all the challenges we have, I remember when our dear aunt, sister, friend, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala was being interviewed for her current position at the World Trade Organization. And of course, there were formidable opponents to her appointment, and she was asked. At the time, of course, the WTO was not very popular. It's probably more popular now because, of course, the same challenges we talked about multilateralism. And she was asked, why do we need the WTO if, the countries that are not as powerful, the not very high net worth countries, don't feel like it represents their interests? And, we have all these challenges. And her answer resonates with me, and I want to build on that. She said, if we did not have an organization like the WTO, we will be talking about and fighting about implementing one or setting one up. It has its issues, but should we throw the baby out with the bathwater? That was kind of her response. But I say that to say, multilateralism is about interests. That's what it's about. It's about individual sovereign interests first. By individual, I mean sovereign national interests. Then it's about collective interests. I think what many, and Ayatollah just mentioned that, what many African countries have experienced is we've been left behind before in negotiating a lot of the multilateral agreements that we're involved in. Maybe except the AFCFTA, because it's an African one. But I don't think we should plan to be left behind again. I think the fact is multilateral agreements are not going away. In fact, they were necessitated by preventing or even war, or going into war, or preventing war. And if you look across the African continent, we have challenges. Our neighbors in the Sahel are struggling. And when there are security issues, it affects the economy drastically. In fact, at SIPE, we have a Business for Peace program, which talks about the role of business, the impact of insecurity, instability, and fragility on businesses. And there are lots of them. In Nigeria, we are fortunate to be talking about it in terms of investments. But in these other countries, they're talking about it in terms of loss of lives and livelihood and what where reconstruction funding will come from. These countries that are going through wars do not yet know who will invest in their reconstruction. But if you were talking about Europe, other European and Western countries, they have the EBRD, and then there's the IBRD, and much of those funds can be diverted to reconstruction. But in our African countries that are going through war and insecurity, does Nigeria have the resources to back a whole reconstruction development fund with the AFDB or the AFC? And their problems will become our problems very, very quickly. So I think in terms of thinking about multilateralism, let's not be fixated on the rigidity and the complexity and the challenges, but let's be fixated on what are the success factors, because many other countries in the West, at least, have made it work for them. I talked about the Paris Accord because, you talked about benchmarking. I think our benchmarking should and can be very aspirational. I know Awolowo had very aspirational plans for Nigeria's education. Why shouldn't we go back to very aspirational benchmarks? but phase them, phase where we want to get to, one step at a time. And I'll talk about some of the success factors later.
Let me quickly go back to, thank you, Lola. Let me go back to Somachi. Somachi, given your experience in the Tony Lumelu Foundation and within your group itself, can you try to give us, without divulging your trade secrets, can you try and share with us, from a practical standpoint, how a company in Nigeria navigates this multilateralism, and how do you set it up, and how do you choose the concentric relationships that you necessarily have to partake in? Do you want to share with us briefly on that? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. I think first is realizing that you bring a lot of value to the negotiating table. We're involved in so many partnerships, like I earlier mentioned, with the European Commission, with the German development agencies, with the AFDB, with AFREXIM, a number of agencies around the world. And how we navigate that is realizing the value that we bring on board. And so not being a receiver of what is told or dictated to you, but being part of that co-creation process. Because otherwise you would adopt or absorb priorities that are different from where you want to go. So I think that realization and that mindset of coming to the table with value and knowing that you're an equal negotiator in any partnership you're conceptualizing, that helps.
Let me further, please. Just stay on that. I once had a conversation with the chairman of a bank with an extensive network within Africa. And I asked, I said, which is the best practice you actually use? He said different countries have different regimes. What they find out is that they look for the country with the most toughest one, and that becomes their own adopted one. So not necessarily what obtains in their own country is that the same with you?
Precisely, exactly. So, but you can't come to the table with value if you haven't done your due diligence and your research and all of that work. So that's how we negotiate some of these partnerships. The second thing is realizing that it's a long-term game, and it's all about relationships in these systems. So also understanding that you have to identify the organizations who have priorities that resemble yours and courting them and negotiating over a long period of time. So it's not an immediate, I'm going to close this deal in the next 2 months. No, it's a long-term game. And we were at, I think, Hong Kong the other day, and one of the panelists was talking about multilateral agreements and saying how a lot of it is structured against Africa. So the standardizations, the expectations already eliminates a lot of African exports. And so how do you begin to charge Africa to export more when a lot of their produce are rejected even when they try to optimize and upgrade their standards? So there's an explicit discrimination, that's what was said, in these systems. But then my argument and our argument is that, we can't come to the table when these deals have been made. We have to be a part of that negotiation process early enough. And where it doesn't suit us, we have to call it out early enough and negotiate around them early enough. Instead of complaining down the line later when these rules have been signed upon and continue to say there's discrimination, I think we have to be more active in the negotiating part.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing experiences. Dr. Ibozo, for a moment, keep your civil society hat on, but try and put on the hat from a democratic process right now. What is a significant lesson you can share with us here that you've seen of an example where it's worked? I'll give you a good example. Were you involved in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement process?
I followed it, but I wasn't involved.
Okay. Give me one near example of something you've been involved with that we can actually benefit from and see how civil society actually gets involved in the whole game.
Yes, one good example will be the Open Government Partnership, OGP, that was signed by Buhari in 2016. Open Government Partnership is a global partnership that governments enter into to promote citizen participation, to promote the use of technology to deal with corruption, to promote transparency and accountability, to promote open procurement. And it has worked globally. It's working in Nigeria, even though slowly. So the federal government has signed on to the partnership. Various state governments have signed on to the partnership. In fact, local governments are even signing on to the partnership right now. Ekiti State government signed on to the partnership recently, and all the local government, especially in view of the current local government autonomy, as I saw the local government discuss with the local government on the possibility of their signing on to the partnership. The area councils in FCT have signed on to the partnership, and ideally is a co-creation mechanism where both government, private sector, and civil society, we co-create the processes of government planning, execution, and evaluation in a way that will promote openness. So, for instance, the procurement aspect of it talks about open procurement, which led to all those issues about Nokopo, which will be, the procurement process will be open, but the challenge really has been a high level of commitment and implementation.
For those who may not know, the OGP report for 2023 is out. It's on their website. Try and read that report, because one of the good things it tells you some good things about your country, because we seem to love the bad tales about Nigeria a lot. It tells us good things about the country, but it actually tells us one major thing, that the mechanism for pass-through is still not yet in place. And that takes me to the question I want to ask Prof. I'll piggyback from what you said, but this is something I'm very particular about. You are aware about an entity called the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. It was supposed to be the underpinning for which we have the public-private partnership compact was drawn around. My estimation is that that compact within the NSG and within business and governments operating is no longer fit for purpose. What is your take?
Thank you very much. I was privileged to be in the pioneer subcommittee of NESG that worked with the World Bank to move businesses from the informal to the formal sector. Truth is, about more than 70% of businesses in Nigeria in the informal sector, you don't see them, and that's why the statistics are never right. So many people are operating under the radar. Now, that effort has somehow, it gained momentum, but to be frank, it has gone down significantly. Now, would I say it's no longer fit for purpose? The need is still there, so I wouldn't say it's not fit for purpose. It needs retweaking. That model, the train has moved far ahead of the model we had. And likewise, countries that were trying to do the same thing. It leads me to sort of like loop to the first question you asked about who would I benchmark with. I have two principles of benchmarking, personal principles, and I've tried to implement it in corporations or institutions I'm involved with. One is never have one role model, because you have one role model for your professional life, for your personal life. Someone will be a role model for being a good father to you, another will be a good role model for being an astute servant leader. Now, look at Rwanda. That will be where I will go to for one reason. Rwanda's president will call a minister and say, congratulations, you're now the minister. Here are the statistics for your industry. There are 4,600 jobs. It contributes 8% to GDP. 300 companies operating here. This is the total tax revenue from your industry. Good luck. I will see you in 1 year's time. If in 1 year you have managed through whatever, sycophancy, people clapping for you, honorable minister, but you've shrunk the statistics, you will be thrown out where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. If he comes back and you have done well, then come in, my faithful servant. We don't have that, right? So you can find a regulator you find a regulator who's focused on the IGR, generating internal revenue, but not looking at the growth of the industry you regulate. Telco is 6%, used to be 6% of GDP in contribution. You should always look at, as a regulator, have I grown this industry? Are there more players? These are reasons why I say benchmark with people who are your mates. So Rwanda today, I would look at them, I won't be comparing myself with South Africa. They're far more advanced economy, far more advanced economy. The PIC alone has $150 billion to play with, to invest where they find fit. Now that's 5 times your foreign reserves or more. So the point I'm making is we look to those countries where we will find, and they will cooperate, as Somachi mentioned, that they will cooperate with you. UAE has a ministry for young people. Just a 22 or 23-year-old minister. So those are the things I would look to, and look to cooperate with these people and be able to take the learning. And it's not a thing of national pride. You don't have to be proud where you're not doing well. The first path to recovery is the truth. One person not to lie to in this whole world is who? Thank you.
We have a ministry for livestock. So we have for livestock as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Ayatollah, given what you have done in terms of in the ESG space, can you help us understand how to have measurable indicators? If you take what Prof. just presented to us, what are those measurable indicators we should be looking for when we are talking about this benchmarking for corporate governance?
Yes, so thank you very much, Femi. I would look at, first of all, the SDG goals. These are multilateral goals that we've signed up to. And I will then drill it down and say, okay, what's important for us as a country? You asked a question to Somachi about what value are we bringing? I would ask the question, what is the value of a Nigerian to the world? We know our young people are valuable. We know that they're valuable from a point of view of human manpower, intelligence, innovation, technology. And so we need to now begin to think about how do we educate them? So education is very important as a benchmark. So quality education is one of those SDG goals that then becomes something that as a nation we need to focus on. Of course, access to energy is important as well. So we have a just energy transition plan. We know that it has to be a renewable mix because we're under pressure to cut fossil fuel production because of our huge contribution to global warming. But again, it's thank God gas is a transition fuel and Nigeria is a gas-rich country. And so what I would do, or what we should do, is take the goals and see which are the goals that are relevant to us as not just relevant to us as a country, but critical to the value we are adding to the world. Every year, the World Economic Forum produces the Global Risk Index or Global Risk Report, which highlights the key risks to the world. Which of those risks is Nigeria best placed to solve as a nation? Because those are the things that when we are able to include that in our national development plan, put that as our objectives as a nation and cascade that down to our own businesses to set realizable targets and meaningful targets around this, puts us in a position to, one, access funding that's available, and two, be able to make sure that we continue to stay relevant and are brought to the table on perhaps a more equal basis. It's also not casting our pearls before swine or selling our birthright. Many times we are being asked to pay for what we already have. We need to, first of all, even identify what our strengths are, what value we are bringing, and then be able to set some meaningful targets about how we're going to prioritize those and how we're going to highlight those. So I'll go further and say, when the SDG goals came out as an organization, what we did was look at the goals, look then at the national development plan that was in place at the time, and say, okay, what are the priorities? And also realistically look at it from the point of view of our company and the fact that, we say that employees are your greatest assets. If we are going to have a good pipeline of employable young people, we have to invest in education as a company, but not at the high school level or even at university level, tertiary level. It has to start at primary level because it's garbage in, garbage out. And so that is why our foundation is focused on primary school education. I would say we need to set, as a nation, targets around that. And we need to set targets that are not just focused on delivering education like we deliver it today. The fact is our population growth, our infrastructure development has not caught up with our population growth. So we need to look at delivering education, maybe using technology. We need to set some targets around that. And then we need to bring the regulators responsible and the agencies of government responsible for delivering on education, kicking them screaming into the 21st century, so that they're able to understand that it's not when you're in a classroom that you're learning. So why don't we, like some foundations are doing, deliver the national curriculum at primary school level using animation, cartoons, which will engage the kids and will mean that at least the lower middle class who have access to technology don't have to necessarily go to a physical classroom to learn. Take the pressure off the physical classrooms. Then again, why don't we then get the ICT ministry? Joined up government is key. When you have the targets that you've set, then you need joined up government in every area of every ministry of government that is going to play into that. Also having targets set for themselves that kind of like can ensure that as a nation, we're meeting those SDG goals that we've set for ourselves. Currently, we're behind in terms of the realization of those goals, of some of those goals. As a nation, we're behind most of them. I think it's only one or two of them that we are on track to deliver on. And so these are some of the things that need to happen. The joined up government, the fact that real targets have to be set for every MDA. They then need to be cascaded down. I mean, NCCC are supposed to ensure that companies have targets for climate change targets. They haven't gotten to that stage yet where they are even able to monitor that. And I want to ask, what are NCCC's own ESG targets? What are their own climate change targets? So until we really set meaningful targets and until we ensure that, forget about multilateralism, in terms of the nation and in terms of the MDAs, that there is joined up government, that we are speaking together with each other, that what one agency does that impacts on the other agency is aligned for growth, and we're not kind of fighting ourselves. I don't think we've really started yet.
Thank you, Ayo. I appreciate
Yes,
it.
sir.
Thank you. I've been told the time is up for the panel, and the only time left is to take your questions, if any. And the mode here suggests there is none. And on that basis, may I just, if there are no questions, seriously, I believe it's very clear what we're dealing with here. And there are no questions here. On that basis, I'd just like to wrap up so that we can have the third panel sessions. But I would give Lola the opportunity to make some closing comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Femi. So very quickly, I think this has been a very interesting panel, and I will point out something we haven't talked about, which is benchmarking, not at sovereign level, not at national level, but even at just company level within our countries. And I'll give you an example of a resource that's very useful for this. It's called Ethics First, which IODCCG is a part of. It builds on excellent ideas like the one that the FRCN launched with the UNGC just a few weeks ago in Abuja, which is the corporate governance principle for MSMEs. But why is this relevant? Talk about what Ethics First is. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because we've talked a lot about strategies for benchmarking and tracking. And there's a famous quote we like to talk about, which is that, culture eats strategy for breakfast. The best laid out policy and strategy or framework can be sabotaged by corruption or unethical practices. And to be honest, in the last 10 or so years, having done a lot of business integrity and specifically anti-corruption training for companies, many mid-sized and small businesses carry out activities and operations in ways that are unethical, but do not know or mean to operate unethically. So there is a certain level of just business integrity awareness that needs to be embedded in the DNA of the way we do business in our country. And so benchmarking can start from that, really. Start from how business A in Abuja operates or does business with business with business B in Kano, for example. Procurement, how we bid, tender, the tendering process, whether we're giving appreciations, it starts from that. And the Ethics First resource was launched in 2020 by SIPE for African countries. And it helps connect businesses with networks, with mentors, with corporate integrity champions, including IODCCG and NGX, to really start from drilling down into just the basics of how to operate with integrity, set frameworks, but also change culture. It's those businesses that are the businesses for the future for Africa, those businesses that understand that we operate in a systemically corrupt setting, and so we need to treat that as a major risk. We need to treat corruption as a major risk and address it. And so with that, I think I've talked about that. We have the Value Chain Integrity Partnership Program, where large multinationals, I call on Owando, ProShare, and the rest, to shake hands with us and help transform the culture within the mid-sized and small business demographic. Because if that mindset starts to shift, then all we're talking about national development has hope of taking effect and transforming the landscape. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so here's the takeaway. The first takeaway is that the IODCCG must leave this venue understanding its responsibility to kickstart the benchmarking role. There is no better platform than the coalition that is formed around the IODCCG. And it will have to help in representing three major things from my own position. One, has anyone bothered to take a list of all the bilateral agreements Nigeria has signed? At the last count I did, it was about 163 of them, majority of which are not being effected. But that is not even the bigger problem. The bigger problem is that there is no nexus between those bilateral agreements with a national development plan. So it's almost as if you are talking on your own and they are doing something on their own. But here's the third leg. The national development plan has no symbiotic relationship with your annual budget. They are almost as if they are bastard children in a family household. We know they exist, but they do not relate to each other. Underpinning that also is also repeating the mistake where you took the presidential system of government, but yet retained the British model of civil service, creating a conundrum in terms of your governance architecture. If there's any major thing, I repeat again, the IODCCG must understand the responsibility the society has bestowed upon it right now. That each and everyone in this room who is not a member should become a member, because therefore, to Lola and Professor's statement, we cannot wait for the public-private partnership architecture to be revolved. We must start within ourselves. And then we must be the examples we seek society to become. And on that note, and on behalf of the distinguished panelists here and Ayatollah over there, thank you for your patience.